Welcome, everyone, to our session today. It is a pleasure to be able to host this conversation on the promise and perils of generative AI in higher education. We're just so glad that you're taking some of your Friday to have this conversation with us, because it's incredibly relevant right now on the scene. Obviously, with AI bursting upon us, it's been here much longer, but bursting upon us in many ways in the public mind starting at the end of November. We have an all-star group of panelists to really help us think through these questions. I'm Michael Horn, and I'm joined today by Anne Arendt, who is the Associate Dean for the College of Engineering and Technology and a faculty member in the Technology Management Unit at Utah Valley University. We have Renee Cummings, who is a professor of practice and data science at UVA's School of Data Science and an expert in artificial intelligence data and tech and their ethics. And so she's going to really be able to bring a lot to this conversation that I think is so important right now about those considerations. And then last but not least, certainly, we have Hannah Kapoor, who is a newly minted graduate from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs with a specialty in tech policy and a minor in journalism. And she has been incredibly active in the student government there. So Hannah, we're really excited that you're able to join us. Congrats on just graduating and bringing that perspective from students to this conversation as well. And I want to start with you, Anne. And actually, first, before I do that, a reminder to the audience, we're going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end of this session for Q&A. So at about 20 after, we'll move to that part of the conversation. But I've got some questions before then for all of you. And Anne, I want to start with you, really setting the table, because as I understand it, you've been active in actually incorporating artificial intelligence into your classroom. And so I'm just curious, like, how you've done that, what impact it has had on student learning and engagement, and maybe what you generalize out of that, right, in terms of what it could enable for classrooms more generally in higher ed.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually using it in a class I have right now almost every week in some different way. So some of the examples of how we use it, because a lot of students know about things like ChatGPT. They go and they ask it questions and it gives them answers, right? And so one of the things I have them do is I actually have them use multiple tools. So I say, okay, go and ask these systems a question, but not just one. So I want you to ask them something like, what is the interrelationships between process, project, and product management in some field of your choosing? And then I want you to ask ChatGPT, Bard, UChat, whatever it is. They have to choose multiples. And then they have to basically compare what those answers are. And then I go back and I say, okay, let's reword that question into this other thing and ask it again and see how that changes. So we're actually, every time they read those responses from the generative AI, they're learning something about whatever it is I'm trying to have them discuss. And so the more I do that, right, they're actually learning how to use these tools to help actually with some of their education. And then they have to spin things into their own words. And then we'll do things like say, well, let's ask it about how they might do that as a Venn diagram, which actually like ChatGPT can't do. So it's interesting to see how it answers that. And then we have a conversation as students as to what might it actually look like if we try to do it. Other things we use, I had just a student actually just yesterday, they went and used the AI generator to make avatars for their name tags because I went and told them they had to have name tags. Some of them are copy editing isn't their forte. So I'll actually tell them about tools like Hemingway Editor or Grammarly, right? And say, these are sort of things that can help you just sort of like your word processor can. Sometimes we'll use the tools to start with initial content. So if for example, it's a lot of introductory stuff. So I'll say something like, I want you to make me a brochure about GIS and how it's used in industry. And so they can actually use some of these tools to help them get started with the content, layout, images, and then we basically add on top of that. And so with copy tools like Copy AI or Write Sonic or something like that. So then we also have, actually it was also yesterday's class, one of my design students was saying he's in animation and he uses the tools basically to get himself started. That's one area where the generative AI has a lot of room for growth. And so it can do it, but you can tell it's AI at this point. And so then to try to use it basically as a starting point. So one of the last examples I'll give actually is one of my fellow faculty had asked me and said, this is an actual question. Suppose I extract structured text from a PowerPoint presentation. I want to have AI generate a new PowerPoint presentation with text and images. What tool would you recommend? And suppose for that same text that was extracted, I want generated script for an avatar to speak, and I want it to generate a video talking about my slides. So he's actually asking for, like, unbeknownst to him, like 5 different tools, technological tools, right? And so I had to write back and basically say, well, you're going to start with something like Quillbot to rewrite some of your content. The avatar part, actually, I would recommend not using generative AI and using something like Adobe Character Illustrator. And then if you're making text to speech, you can go back into AI and use like a natural reader, right? And so now we're basically popping in and out of using AI tools where they're useful. But in the world of students, one of the reasons I use it as much as I can in my classroom, whether it's writing help or getting answers or getting images or music or anything, is I want it to be a level playing field. And so I don't want some students having an advantage because they know about the tools and other students do not. So for my part, I believe you're going to get a handout of a pile of free-ish AI tools, because I also want them working with in the less expensive world. And those, I give that to my students the first day of class, and we talk our way through it so that they know what's out there, and so they can use it in my class and use it in the rest of their lives, basically. And then we follow that with some conversation about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the ethics behind it, which I think is going to come up soon.
Yeah, no, we're going to go right there in a moment, but just for those following along, and just reference those free or free-ish tools. That is in the chat. If you scroll back a little bit, there's a Google Doc link there. Maybe we can pop that back in one more time. There we go. Thank you. And then Cassandra, you also asked a question around willing to share your assignment with us, and that's probably a pretty good place to get that. And Anne says yes, so we can add that to the Google Doc maybe. So, and Marianne, we've got the tools there. So Renee, let me turn to you then on just where Anne led us, which is the ethics questions around this and the conversations that we ought to be thinking about from ethical dimensions. And I'd love you maybe generally thinking, helping us walk through some of the ethical challenges around using AI for teaching and learning that you're seeing, and sort of maybe it's the wrong way to think about it, but like, what's the most pressing ethical considerations right now? Because I'm sure there's a long list of them, but what as faculty members should we really be thinking about and grappling with right now from an ethical perspective?
I thank you so much, Michael. And of course, Anne, thank you so much for sharing all that insight into what's happening in the classroom. I will say this, first of all, it's an honor and it's a pleasure to be a part of the Education Summit 2023. So my students at the University of Virginia School of Data Science are master's students, and many of them are designing these tools and deploying these tools. So when I'm teaching big data ethics, I'm really teaching students to understand the big questions when we're talking about AI, and that would be transparency, accountability, auditability, explainability, fairness. So looking at those big questions, we've got to understand, in particular at this moment, we're talking about generative AI. And one of the things that I always say about AI is a language. So you've got to understand the language. You've got to understand the tone, the tenor, the texture, even the tropes of this language, because it's the language that we're using at the moment to communicate with each other, and of course in real time. So when we're talking about AI ethics, we've got to talk about the data. There is no AI without data. And it's so important to think about data, because the ethical challenges that we continue to see in artificial intelligence come from our data sets, in particular, historical data sets. And I always say that historical data sets carry 2 types of meaning: computational meaning and cultural meaning. And it is that gap or that loophole between culture and computation where we get many of these challenges. So what we have seen with our historical data, and it's something that I like people to think about, is that historical data carries a memory. And in that memory, you would find many of the troubling and painful and traumatic experiences. And when we're thinking about large language models, we're thinking about models that have scraped pretty much the history of the internet. And we're thinking about all that has been said, all that has been shared, all that has been communicated, now coming together into one model that we're using. So there's some things in there that may be great, but there are some things in there that would be dangerous. So we've got to think about these models. We've got to think about the limitation of the models, but we've also got to think about how do we innovate with it. So I have had conversations over the last maybe 6 months with from high school students to high school principals to other members of faculty to corporate, where individuals are actually designing, developing, deploying, and adopting and adapting these technologies. So from an ethical perspective, I would say this: we've got to really think critically about the data that's being used. We've got to think critically about questions around copyright, because those questions have not been sorted out just yet when we think about AI, in particular, generative AI. We've got to think about intellectual property. We've got to think about contract law, because all of these are now presenting some very unique challenges for the way this technology is being used. And we've got to ensure that we really bring our students to a place where they're thinking critically about knowledge, because this is what generative AI has done. It has created a conversation around knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we access knowledge? How do we use this knowledge? And it's very important for students to understand that generative tools are tools. They are language models. They are not knowledge models. So it's not a place for your knowledge to stop, but it's something to assist you to stretch that imagination even further.
Super illuminating, Renee, because I think it gives us a real range of the sets of questions we ought to be asking, some of which I think are more apparent than others. And some of them, when they intersect with legal questions, for example, right, and things of that nature, of who do we even attribute ownership of decisions to, and things of that nature, get really sticky and tax all of us. So appreciate that overview. Hannah, I want to come to you next, because, you know, we talk a lot about teaching and learning in this context from the faculty members, but you're a student on the ground experiencing this. I will say there's been a bit of a theme I have picked up on in the media, where people say, oh, students are so much further ahead of their faculty and teachers, right, on the use of AI. They're much more active in using it and so forth. But I've also talked to people who've said, that's not quite as, you know, clear as maybe you think it is, because there's a lot of anxiety on the part of students in terms of not just what's allowed or not allowed, but also how is it going to change the nature of what we're preparing for, the nature of work and jobs and things of that nature. And so I'm just sort of curious for you to level set us. It's probably unfair to ask you to speak for all the students, but give us some perspective on, you know, what some of the sentiment that you've heard around AI as a student, the anxiety that you may or may not have heard around it, and sort of what are the questions you and your fellow classmates have been asking?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for the question, Michael, and thank you, Professor Arndt and Professor Cummings, for allowing me to join in on this conversation with you all. And I think, you know, the sentiment surrounding AI, it's very multifaceted, but I think the first thing as a student, and I think just as a human being in this digital age, when we think about AI, it's really exciting. I think when ChatGPT came out, the first use case I heard of it is that you could tell ChatGPT exactly what was in your pantry, and it would fine tune, you know, whatever recipe you're trying to make with what you had. And then, of course, every day different use cases are being discovered. You know, when you talk about the student perspective, I think the elephant in the room is how are students going to leverage these tools to cheat? There's really no dancing around that question. And I think my response to that is, you know, absolutely. There's a lot of fear surrounding how these models can be used. And it's already being seen. You know, students are experimenting with what they can do in the classroom. And I think it's also just very natural for young people to push limits. And I think that's definitely going to be happening. At Princeton, one thing we've already seen from what I saw with my experience on the student government is that we have an honor committee that adjudicates violations to our honor code, and they're already facing cases of professors making claims that students wrongfully used these language tools, but the university doesn't have really much context on how to adjudicate, because what we're seeing here is that the current level of knowledge we have is that there's arbitrary evidence determining what goes into a learned language model, an LLM, whether or not a student is using it, and how can you really bring accountability in this space that's evolving so rapidly. So my first response to your question is like, what is the sentiment surrounding AI? I think first is excitement. I think everybody wants to experiment. And I think the second, in the context of education, is a little bit of fear. Am I going to be punished for experimenting with these tools? Will I be wrongfully accused? There have been cases of that in the media. And I think those are some pretty serious allegations. And there's a lot to be said on both fronts, but I guess one thing that it's important to just set the tone with, and this is my personal opinion, and again, I don't know if I speak for all students. I think when you're in the face of so much uncertainty, whether you're an educator or a student in the face of technology, it's easy to fear it and be like, okay, well, instead of embracing AI tools and all the other technological advances that have been brought into the classroom, it might be easy to say, you know what, we're going to return to handwriting, or we're just going to abandon technology altogether and then just make sure students can't cheat so we can protect what we already have. And that's a bit of an extreme example, but I will say the one thing I fear as a student is just kind of this culture is a culture of fear surrounding AI, that educators won't embrace them. And I think what would be most meaningful is for students to be able to have open conversations with educators about how they're experimenting with these tools, testing the limits with them so people can learn together. I think that touches upon a bit of what you said about, are educators running behind students? Yes and no. I think it depends on the context. But if we want to address that, I think it all starts with just having an open conversation and embracing these tools and figuring out how we can use higher ed as a sandbox for just experimenting as a whole in society.
All right, so this terrific set of answers there, Hannah. And for those of you that are trying to get in on the Q&A, I see someone has raised a hand, for example. We're not going to do any calling live during the session. We're going to read things from the Q&A function. So insert your question there. There's some good questions coming in. We will do our best to address them. But I want to go, Anne, to you, because coming out of what Hannah just said, I actually want to ask you two questions, Anne, but I'll ask one at first. I'm really bad at this. So I'm going to start with this question, which is, you just heard some of Hannah's concerns, right? About how students might get punished or unfairly accused, right? And things of that nature. How would you respond to her? And what do you think faculty, the position that they ought to be adopting in this? We just heard a call for higher ed to be a much more open sandbox. What's your thoughts?
So one of the largest concerns, right, is students being accused of cheating, I would say. And so I do tell my students, you have to go talk to every faculty member that you have to see how they feel about the use of some of these tools. But honestly, those issues are issues we've been grappling with well before the new boom of generative AI. So if we look at actually things like Course Hero, right? So if we look at tools that help students get understanding or do quiz practice or crowdsource answers or take pictures of math questions and get the results, right? Those have all been around for years and years and years. And that has been an issue for faculty grappling with what cheating means, right? So at what point are those tools like a tutoring service to the students? And at what point are those tools actually seen as something like cheating? And then some of the paper writing tools have also been around for years. And so to be honest, I think one of the best things to do is actually have a conversation with your faculty members about what cheating, how they actually perceive cheating, and how they perceive the importance of rote memorization in whatever the topic is at hand, right? So in some classes, what we want is we want students to be able to get to the right answer as quickly as possible and have it be accurate, timely, and relevant, right? And if I can teach them that using tools, then or the students can convince me that's the case, then I'm all for it. There's other times when I need them to be able to get to the right answer without using any tools at all. And they're very circumstantially based and very class-based. And so I think having conversations like that between the instructor and the students, right? What might this mean? And then boundaries as to what the teacher feels is getting academic support versus what they would deem as cheating, in particular in the relationship to what they perceive to be plagiarism. And I don't think there's a set line in the sand. I think it's actually going to move around based on that faculty member and based on the topic at hand. So I actually encourage students, right, to have more conversations with their faculty and vice versa, and have conversations inside of their student governance bodies, because at most institutions, those student governance bodies are some of the biggest voices on campus. And ask some of these questions and get us to tell you the answers.
I'm hearing like Little Mermaid in my head when you say it that way. But the question I want to go to, Renee, is before I come back to you, Anne, with another set of questions around this. Renee, I'd love your take actually as well on some of these anxieties. Like from your perspective, looking at this as an ethicist, how would you frame your response to it? Where is it the same as Anne's advice, and maybe where is it different? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll have to agree with Hannah. I think it comes from a place, of course, of excitement. I think students are very excited about it. I think people are really excited about innovating with it. I think people are excited about it because it makes them feel more creative. It makes them feel more knowledgeable. It makes them feel as though they just have a greater bandwidth when it comes to really taking on intellectual challenges. And that's the beautiful thing, because what it's doing is sparking imagination. But I think people have got to understand the ethics, how do we do this ethically? They've got to understand questions around AI hallucination, and questions around deception, and questions around manipulation, and questions around how you can be duped by the technology. So I think those are the things that we've got to do. There's no need to fear. And I always say, AI is the language that we are communicating in now. There really is no need to fear. So this education around AI and around large language models like ChatGPT needs to be a broader education outside of the academy as well. We need public education. We need public engagement around using these tools, because students are using these tools. Their parents are using these tools. And I don't really have a challenge with students cheating. Maybe because my students are just at a different level, and many of them are professionals as well, professional data scientists who are now pursuing master's degrees, who have been designing these tools, who've been working with these tools. I think we've just got to understand that these are tools, and we've got to understand that these tools are only going to get better. They are only going to get better, and they are only going to get faster. The challenge from an ethical perspective is because the iterations of these tools are moving so quickly, it becomes really challenging from a governance and a policy perspective as how to deploy policy to deal with some of these challenges. So within the C-suite, the questions, as I said, are around copyright and intellectual property and contract law and just law in general. How do we do this thing? How do we push the envelope of creativity, or how do we push, to get to the front line of efficiency and effectiveness and excellence with these tools? But how do we do this thing ethically? And one of the things that we've got to understand is that the opacity of the data sets that are being used to create AI, and to create in particular large language models, continue to replicate particular challenges around accuracy, around accountability, around transparency. We know AI hallucinations have shown us that there are challenges with explainability when it comes to this technology. And of course, there are questions around fairness, because we continue to see bias and discrimination and systemic challenges popping up in the kinds of answers, the kinds of knowledge that these large language models are providing. So it is so critical for us, not only in academia, but for us just as society, to really educate ourselves on this technology, because the technology isn't going anywhere, and the technology is already ways ahead of us. So we really have got to upskill ourselves in real time. We've got to know how to do this thing ethically. We've got to understand, as I said, the capabilities of this technology as well as its limitations. And you've got to understand that it is a learning tool. It is not knowledge. It is a learning tool that is going to help facilitate some of the work that you need to do. Some of the things they're going to make easier, and some of the things they're going to make a little more difficult. Because if faculty are dealing with cheating, now faculty are going to get much more creative in the ways in which they're grading and the kinds of ways they want students now to probably be more interactive. So not only are you submitting a paper, but you're doing some sort of one-on-one conversation in class, speaking about the research to test your knowledge as opposed to testing ChatGPT's knowledge.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much there. I want to go back to you before, Hannah, I bring you back in the conversation in a moment, just because that's a lot to stay up on, to educate ourselves on. How do you recommend faculty members really keep up, right, with all of those sets of issues that Renee is bringing up that we need to be thinking about, that intersect with society in ways that could be changing, frankly, as it continues to iterate, the law changes in some cases or gets clarified in other cases. I'm just sort of curious, you know, how you think about these ethical considerations and helping faculty members keep up with, you know, how to frame them, if you will.
Yeah, so coming off of some of the things that Renee said, so like I think in the conversation of the legal aspects of it, every time we have a new breaking technology, the laws and regulations are completely behind, right? And so basically to just honestly say that, like in 2 years, we will be in a different place than we are right now, but right now we are not. So we are basically learning how to police some of this ourselves until some of that comes to be. I think hitting the point that none of these tools, and in particular in the AI world, are perfect, right? So the answers are not always right. The answers are indeed sometimes biased. It is based on the data. So to have that, to actually, before even looking at, do you know this particular tool, right? Do you know what the music creator is to have that conversation about how do we think these things are even working, right? What is the, fundamentally at least, how does this type of thing come to the answers it comes to? Because I think it helps us understand then the results that we're getting. So as faculty, I think we have to start kind of there, like get a picture of what this is actually trying to do. We don't have to be the programmers, but we have to see that. And then say, okay, so where might things go south? And then for each discipline, then you can say, you can have conversations about what tools are likely to impact my particular discipline. And then go on a finding mission, right? Like challenge the faculty to be like, go see who can find the best tool that can generate music that could be used for free without copyright violation, right? And see what they come up with. And then have that conversation with the students, right? Because the students are, at least some of the students are doing that very thing, right? And so some people will be uncomfortable with sharing a list of tools. I obviously am not. I think the more that we can actually help each other learn, the better off we are. There is lists of tools out there, right? And so go start looking at those. Lots of these have free trials. It'll be 10 minutes, 2 tries, 5 images, right? Whatever it is, go and see what they can do, right? So that we can understand what our options even are.
No, that's super helpful. And I suspect going to be widely useful to the audience today. There's so many questions coming in. I want to ask one more question myself and then get to all these great questions so we can bring your voices in. Hannah, you'll get the last word though from my questions, which I'm just sort of curious how all that advice lands with you in terms of the student experience and where it does or doesn't make you more comfortable, where it gives more and more anxiety. And what are you looking for from faculty members to support you in navigating this landscape of AI with the student hat on?
So I think I would answer your question in 2 parts. I think the first, there's Miss Heather Brown in the chat who I think really captures it perfectly, is as educators, or just, you know, as students and educators, we need to ask ourselves what motivates us and why do students really cheat? And I think the conversation has exacerbated with the rollout of AI, but the truth of the matter is academic integrity has been on the decline for a really long time. And I said this in one of the previous panels, but I think a reckoning with how we inspire creative thinking has been around the corner for a really long time. And I think if AI is what prompts it, I think that's a really great thing. And this question of why students cheat, why is there a decline in academic integrity? I think that's an entirely different conversation. Some people credit it to pressure cooker schools and this obsessment with achievement culture. And I don't know what that answer is, but I do think, it definitely will require a new type of creativity when it comes to teaching. And I think that's a huge onus to put on teachers who already have so much on their plates. But I think if we kind of accept that as kind of a truth of what comes along with innovation in education, I think it'll be so much easier to adapt. The second part of your question, I think in terms of just what else how students kind of wrestle with these concerns, I think there's different kinds of students, right? So you have the student who's going to cheat and who's going to abuse the AI model. Maybe they're doing it consciously, maybe they're just trying to get their work done. But the reality is they're going to be entering into a very evolving workforce. Right now, we're only gotten a glimpse of how AI tools are being used. I'm sure a year from now, and then 5 years down the line, it's going to be a very different landscape. So I just graduated from college. I'm in the process of submitting applications for full-time jobs. And something that I'm seeing now that I didn't really see 3 months ago is a checkbox asking me if I used a language tool in the free response questions, for these applications. And I think that's super interesting, right? Because it's very exciting, this idea of, like that basic question, why do you want to work at this company, right? You could totally get an outline from these learned language models. I already know how to write these things. My critical thinking really isn't in danger. I'm already a college graduate. But what these employers want to know is, well, how can I determine what her communication skills are going to be like down the line? And that's just a glimpse of how everything is changing. So as a student, I have that pressure. I need to make sure I can actually handle my job. It's not just a matter of getting it. But I think that's a tale as old as time, right? When it comes to cheating, that's what they told us in elementary school. Like, you cheat now, you're not going to be able to, handle things later on. So I think that awareness is always there. And I think it's just important to remind students. So it's one thing to motivate students to do the work no matter what the subject is, but then to also motivate students that, hey, you should know how to use these AI tools beyond just inputting and outputting information, because what a valuable skill set is going to be in a couple of years is kind of learning how to leverage these tools to think critically and just to use them as the baseline. That's where I think industries are headed. And I think that's what needs to be communicated to students and can be achieved by kind of creating that welcoming environment I mentioned moments ago between students and teachers, where they can openly experiment with these tools.
Great set of thoughts, Hannah, and touched on a lot of really important issues about the changing landscape and the contract, if you will, and the honesty and trust that we should have in this environment. And I think as we turn to the questions from all of you in our virtual audience, although very much real wherever you are, I think it goes to a bunch of the questions that I've seen pop up, which is around this line of, and Hannah, you said, like, students should want to learn, like it's their futures, right, that they're preparing for. In some sense, they're cheating themselves out. So Herb Coleman, for example, asked, where does cheating begin and learning end? There's a bunch of questions around the importance of up-leveling the assignments themselves, so perhaps they're not so that perhaps they're more AI proof. There's a bunch of questions around, Hartmut asks, perhaps we as faculty should start working together with our students. For example, give them responsibility by treating them as partners and refraining from a top-down approach as much as possible. Students inherently want to learn, not cheat. And sometimes I've been thinking I have learned more from my students than they have learned from me by using this approach. So I'd actually love all of you to weigh in if you want around how we think about the assignments themselves and sort of creating a more of a trust culture, and we're working together as opposed to an I gotcha culture, right? And things of that nature. And you are nodding vigorously, so maybe I'll go to you first, but then Renee and Hannah, don't hesitate to come off mute and just jump in.
So one of the things I do is actually when I start my class, I actually have a conversation about why is the student in the room, right? And so not only why are you in the room because you want to be proficient in whatever your field is in most cases, not all, right? But even if that isn't you and you're an undecided student, you are paying to be in that room to learn things. And as a matter of fact, for 1 hour in the room, you're probably paying I don't know, $50 an hour, $100 an hour, whatever the tuition, if you divided your tuition up, right, to the hours you're in a classroom. So then I bring that up and I say, that you should be getting from this class experience knowledge and growth, right, that you're paying for. If you choose not to, that is on you. That is a choice that we as human beings get to make. But just be aware that that is a choice that you're making, right? So the point of being in higher education is to learn, and even more so to become a lifelong learner, right? So if I can teach my students how to use these tools or any other tools to be a better lifelong learner, or to be curious in ways they were not before, or to transfer knowledge from one area to another, which is a skill set that not everybody has, right? I'm going to do that. And so I think not even reminding, having a discussion with students about what is their intention in being in the classroom, and then going off of that. So that's the way we start out.
I'll just jump in there and say, I think it's important for faculty to really have conversations around data ethics and AI ethics with students. It's important before you even jump in to using those tools. And I'll also say this, and it's something that I think our students should also know. Many of these tools were built on cheating, because much of the data that's being used in these tools were data that was scraped from the internet. Much of the ways in which this technology has been designed, it's really our data that's being monetized, and oftentimes in many of these tools weaponized against us. So there's been a lot of cheating by big tech to create these tools, because none of us has ever received any kind of profit or any kind of or any sort of anything for our data that's been scraped. It's this. Listen, I don't talk about cheating, and this is the first time I'm even in a conversation where the word cheating is happening so much. So I would think maybe, as I said, the students that I deal with at the master's level, it's just a different approach to the ways in which we are doing this, because many of them are actually designing these tools. So they really want that ethical perspective, because what they don't want is to create some sort of a crisis when they deploy this technology, when a client buys these tools. And I think we don't want to focus on cheating, because I think what we want to focus on is stretching our imagination. How do we use these tools to do extraordinary things? These tools have the ability to help us answer some of the biggest questions as we are seeing when we think about healthcare, when we think about medical approaches, when we think about ways in which different fields and different disciplines are using ChatGPT, AI in general, has the ability to reimagine just about every business model, to bring extraordinary excellence to the ways in which we've been doing things, to really reimagine the systems that we've been using. But we've got to understand the ethics. We've got to understand that transparency is a challenge, accountability is a challenge, accuracy is a challenge. We cannot take all of this information at face value. So if anything, these tools need to help students want to continue to be intellectually curious, if not more, to want to drill deeper. These tools are supposed to build critical thinkers who want to go beyond whatever ChatGPT has offered. So I think as academics and as faculty, as individuals working in academia, I think our job is to inspire. I think our job is to stretch the imagination. I think our job is to bring those interdisciplinary perspectives in the space and really excite students about innovating, but understanding that you've got to innovate ethically with the knowledge that's required. So you don't drive a car without preparing yourself to drive that car, without understanding, what is required. And it comes to AI, it's the same thing. They've got to prepare themselves to use the tool, and that preparation has got to be built in a space where they understand the long-term ethical challenges of the technology and its impact on society.
I think very quickly, I'd like to add on, I think Professor Cummings raises a really interesting kind of skepticism about these AI models and what they're trained on. And I think that's a really relevant social concern that just not only students, but citizens in general should be equipping themselves for, because that's a concern that's not just for the classroom, that has to do with the news we consume, how we vote in elections, how we kind of evaluate the credibility of what is in front of us. So I think that makes a really compelling call for media literacy, which again, starts in the classroom. And then as a little bit of a tangent, but it kind of touches upon the question you asked, Michael, that I'd like to raise in terms of just thinking of ways how we can bring this into the classroom. Something really fun I saw this past semester that I think is worth sharing is, a professor tried to kind of experiment. It was a random class, it wasn't an English class, it wasn't a computer science class, but she wanted to see how she can get her students to really experiment with ChatGPT. And she had her seminar form like a committee between the students. And every week, the students had to select one person to do their weekly reading response on ChatGPT. So they all had to submit 500 words a week. One student had permission to do it on ChatGPT. And as part of their weekly class discussion, everyone had to, it was kind of a students versus teacher challenge, see, hey, which of these was made by the computer? And part of that exercise was a synthesis of information. They were evaluating, did the sources really say this? Is this the best way to present an argument? And I thought that was such a really fun and creative way to get people to not only kind of sharpen their media literacy, but also engage with this technology and the curriculum in a very cool and new way.
Hannah, don't go anywhere. I want to stay with you in this next set of questions, because we had Rosalind Douglas asked if Hannah could elaborate about how your critical thinking skills were not impacted after using the language model, because this is a fear for faculty who are teaching writing courses. And more generally, Bill Sumrald, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that last name correctly, but apologies if I'm not, asked, how can we use AI to help with teaching critical thinking? So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and to clarify, I never meant to say my critical thinking skills were not affected by the models. I think that is the main concern. And I think as a student at my stage in higher ed, I'm in a point of privilege where I feel like I've already had to go through everything without having these models at my disposal, where I'm not too worried about them being a scapegoat for my particular stage in my education. That's what I meant to reference earlier. But I think, the challenge of getting students to engage critically, I think the example I just shared is one way of a creative pedagogical practice that will engage students. But the other part, it's a mixture of accountability, I think, motivating students to really want to learn, and then just restructuring assignments where that these models can just can be used, plain and simple. And I think, again, that's another burden to place on educators, which I'm very sympathetic to. But I think, that's one of the adaptations that might be inevitable. And I'll also note that the conversation in higher ed is a little bit different than the one for K through 12, because I think, the foundational critical thinking skills at K through 12, like you need those to live. Whereas in higher ed, I think the conversation is more about how do you really motivate students and make them question why are they even pursuing their education in the first place.
It's a great place, I think, to leave it and leave us with thoughts as well as questions. We are unfortunately out of time. There are a couple more questions I was really dying to get to around accessibility and equity and things of that nature. But unfortunately, we're at the half hour when we all get the virtual, if you will, hook. But just join me in thanking Anne, Renee, Hannah. Terrific conversation. I know this is really on all of our minds and very important for us all to be thinking through, grappling with, and staying on top of. And thank you on behalf of Course Hero as well for joining this session so enthusiastically. Appreciate it and enjoy the remainder of the summit.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you to all of you. Take care now. Goodbye.